Welcome back to the Enduring Aesthetics Podcast, guys. I'm Daniel, and this is Clint.
Hey, guys.
We like to get together every week and talk about classic bodybuilding stories from the past. Today we've got a really exciting episode. Clint is going to share some stories, and we're going to talk a little bit about a guy named Professor Attila. Clint, why don't you start us off and tell us, start us off with a synopsis. Who is Professor Attila?
Sure, absolutely. So last week we talked about Sandow, right? And essentially talked a little bit about his mentor, Professor Attila, who, basically discovered him. So, but he's much more important to bodybuilding than just discovering the father of bodybuilding. So I kind of wanted to touch on him a little bit and let our viewers know who he was, because he's a lot more important to bodybuilding, and not many people know about him. We were talking about...
Yeah, I actually didn't know that Sandow even had anybody that did train him. I thought he was like self-taught, right, or had learned from, reading something from ancient Greek or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have heard of Sandow, don't really know a lot about him, but hardly anybody's heard of Professor Attila. So let's dive in. Just like Sandow, Ludwig Durlacher was his given name when he was born in 1844, and he was German as well, just like Sandow. At his peak physical condition, he was about 5'4", small guy, and weighed around 175 pounds. He got started in lifting weights, bodybuilding, when he saw the Italian strongman, I think this is how you pronounce his name, Felice Napoli, and then he decided that he wanted to be a strongman as well. So he talked to him and got an apprenticeship under him and studied how to become a strongman, and then took out on his own with a solo strongman act under the name Attila. He adopted that as his stage name in 1863 when he was 19 years old. Some important things about him: he's generally considered to be the inventor of the bent press, which we don't really do anymore. It's not really that good on the joints. I think I sent you some pictures of that. He was considered the inventor of the shot loading glow barbell, the barbells with the big rounded metal weights on the sides that we think of when we think of the old time strongmen. And something
that's the one that Sandow's holding in the actual trophy, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The old time barbells. And then something that we still use today, he's considered the inventor of the Roman chair, which of course is a great ab exercise. So he did his strongman act for several years, a little over 20 years. And he noticed that he was constantly asked for training advice from others. And so at the age of 42, around 1886 or 1887, he decided to kind of shift his focus from the strongman act and get into the gym business. So he opened a gym in Brussels and started training others and, kind of supplementing his income from the strongman acts with his gym. It was there in his gym in Brussels that he probably met Sandow. We don't know for sure, but that's where everyone thinks it probably occurred. And he noticed the great potential of Sandow, and he started training him to be a strongman as well. And he started training him, and this is where Professor Attila is very important to bodybuilding. He was pretty much the first person to understand progressive weight training that we use today, that bodybuilders use, which is essentially that in order to get bigger muscles, you have to lift big. You have to increase the weight, you have to increase the reps, increase the sets. He understood that. And
so he's likely one of the first people to record how much weight and progressively go heavier and heavier?
Yeah, absolutely. The training up until that time was more kind of like a circuit training almost,
Okay.
if you're going to do different exercises, kind of lighter weight, higher reps, and real quick. It was almost more cardio that they were doing back then, and he kind of understood the fact that probably, I'm guessing through experimentation on himself, that that the muscles grew the more weight you used, and the more sets you did, and things like that. So
right.
In my opinion, that's kind of his greatest contribution to bodybuilding. That I guess, and discovering Sandow.
So he essentially changed the way that people worked out.
Yeah, exactly. And
Wow.
And his first gym was in Brussels, but he would everywhere he went, and of course, he traveled with Sandow doing strongman acts and things like that. Everywhere he went in many different countries, he opened gyms, and so across those gyms, he incorporated the progressive weight training. So more and more people started lifting like he was, and so the idea of it just kind of spread along with his gyms all over the world. So I think that was really important in the development of bodybuilding. So eventually he goes to America. He arrived in New York City in 1893, and he opened a gym there. Another big thing about him was he was one of the first ones to realize the benefits that weightlifting had to sports, to athletic performance. And so he started, he actually sought out, high-level athletes in America, and basically said, I want to train you. I want people to see, how much better athletes can be with weight training in their respective sports.
So he actually had to go and sell it. They didn't come to him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because, up until, even into the, probably, 50s and 60s, maybe even into the 70s, doctors were still under the impression that, lifting weight like that was bad for your health, bad for your heart.
Wow.
There was this idea that you would become, muscle bound, which is kind of a compliment these days for someone to tell you that you're muscle bound. But back then it was more meant that, you're so muscular that you really can't move. You're not flexible. You're just like a giant meatball, basically. And that's what the doctors of that day thought. And not only that, that's what the coaches thought, in football, basketball, all the major sports. So they would actually, tell their athletes not to lift weights because they were worried about potentially detrimental effects to, the sport that their athletes were playing in if they lifted these weights. They, with the increased muscle, they might become slower, less flexible, things like that. And, it's funny that we've actually found that, for it to be the opposite of that it increases athletic performance, increases speed, and things like that. Of course, depending on, how you're lifting and things like that.
Right.
But yeah, no, it wasn't a popular idea. So yeah, he actually did have to sell it, like you said, and he would actually take out ads in the big kind of sporting newspaper back then, which was called the Police Gazette. And one person that he got in contact with that actually took him up on this offer was he was at the time the world heavyweight champion in boxing, James Corbett, also known as Gentleman Jim was his nickname. And he sought him out because he wanted to increase his punching power for his next bout. And so he trained with Professor Attila, and in his next fight, which was against Charlie Mitchell, he knocked him out in only 3 rounds. And I've noted here, I looked at Gentleman Jim's entire career, and that was the quickest knockout of his career by far. So, whatever.
So definitive proof right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And he gave Professor Attila a lot of credit for it in the future, and was, quick to point out that if it wouldn't have been for him, he wouldn't have done as well. So we're starting to see through Professor Attila, how helpful weight training can be in sports. And another really interesting thing about Professor Attila is he was, probably one of the first gym owners ever to train women, and to actually invite women into his gym, and they would train right along with the men, like occurs today in all the gyms. And
that's a really big deal. I mean,
yeah.
When was this? Around what time?
The 1890s.
Wow.
You're right. I mean, it's a big deal, and you even hear, guys talk into the 50s, 60s, 70s about how a lot of these gyms they went to, the silver and golden era bodybuilders, how they were for men only. A lot of women weren't allowed, or it really wasn't until the 80s that they, in the big fitness craze in the 80s, that they started combining men and women into gyms and things like that.
So he was way ahead of the curve then.
Absolutely, yeah. When it came to weight training, when it came to training women, yeah, he was ahead of his time. Another thing I have noted on here is that he was one of the first people to realize that weight training reduced the aging process. That the more that you train, the easier it is the older you get. So
okay,
and that was directly in conflict with how they thought back then. And so it's just.
So did he weight train into old age as well?
He did, yeah. He continued to train. I have here in my notes that he died in 1924, so he would have been about 80 years old. Which of course,
wow.
I mean that's a good life these days. That was definitely a well-lived
a great life back then, yeah.
Yeah, back for the late 1800s, early 1900s. So, yeah, I mean he was just ahead of his time when it came to weightlifting. And then some other notes I have here is that he coached many old-time strongmen, including Louis Cyr, who's we might make a video on him too. He's regarded by a lot of people as probably the strongest man ever. The stuff that he did was just incredible, and he was trained by Professor Attila, and Professor Attila was also fluent in 5 different languages, which, because of that and his great, training advice, I have here that he was the advisor or the consultant to the King of England, King of Denmark, King of Greece, and the Tsarina of Russia. So,
that's epic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I have on here too, the last little note I have is that his youngest daughter, whose name was Grace, she married the famous strongman bodybuilder Siegmund Klein, who we might do a video on as well, who was a great bodybuilder in the Bronze Age and Silver Age as well, who ran a famous gym in New York City, who actually took over operating his Professor Attila's gym. And that gym didn't close until 1974. So, the gym was running for about 80 years. So it must have done very well. A man ahead of his time, and someone who, we can thank for giving us the reason that we lift the way we do today as bodybuilders.
Yeah. I mean, totally turning the way we train around, and then training the father of bodybuilding. I would consider that pretty huge.
Right. Yeah, he played a large part in the history of bodybuilding, and very very few know anything about him. So really interesting guy.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Enduring Aesthetics Podcast. If you did like the episode, don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment below what you liked best and what you'd like to see in the future. Clint and I are going to be getting together each week to talk about classic bodybuilding and classic bodybuilding history. You can find this podcast here on YouTube each week or on your favorite player. like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher. See you next week, guys.